All right, guys. Time to continue Huckleberry Finn. Remember yesterday we did the first 2 chapters. Today we're going to read chapters 3 and 4. All right? Everybody ready? Let's do this. Chapter 3, Escape. The trial went slowly, so every now and then I had to borrow some money from the judge to give to Pap. Whenever he got the money, he got drunk and made a big commotion in town. Then he was thrown in jail. This happened again and again. He got to hanging around the widow's so much that she told him if he didn't quit it, she would make trouble for him. This got the old man real angry. So he watched for me, and one day in the spring, he grabbed me. He took me up the river about 3 miles and crossed over to the Illinois shore where it was woody and deserted with no houses. We walked through the woods until we came to the old log cabin where he once lived. For the next few months, we lived on the food we hunted and fished. Every once in a while, Pap locked me in the cabin and went to the store to trade fish and game for whiskey. He'd fetch it home and get drunk. Then he'd lock the door at night and put the key under his head alongside his gun. But by and by, Pap got too handy with his belt when he got drunk. And I couldn't stand it. I was covered with welts and bruises. He got to going away a lot too. And he would lock me in the cabin so I wouldn't escape. Once, he locked me in and was gone for 3 days. I was terribly lonesome and scared. I thought maybe he'd drowned, and I was sure I would never get out again. I had to figure out some way to escape. I had tried to get out of the cabin many a time, but I just couldn't figure out how. When Pap was away, he was pretty careful not to leave a knife or anything in the cabin for me to cut through the floor. The windows weren't big enough for even a dog to get through. The chimney was too narrow to climb up, and the door was made of thick, solid oak slabs. Wow. Finally, I found an old rusty saw with a broken handle. I fixed the handle and looked for a place to start sawing. There, behind a table at the far end of the cabin, was an old horse blanket nailed against the log wall. I got under the table, raised the blanket, and went to work sawing out a section of the big bottom log for me to escape through. Wow. Well, it was a long job, but I was getting towards the end when I heard Pap's gun in the woods. I got rid of any signs of my work, dropped the blanket over the hole, and hid my saw. Pretty soon, Pap came in. He was in his usual mood, a bad one. He said he'd been downtown and everything was going wrong. His lawyer said the trial would take a long time and there would be no money until the court made a decision. Meanwhile, the widow had been looking for me. She'd sent a man to try to follow Pap, but Pap drove him off with his shotgun. After that, he threatened to hide me in another place where no one would find me. So I decided that if I could keep Pap and the widow from trying to find me, then I would really be free. After we had dinner, Pap locked me up in the cabin and went back to town. I judged he wouldn't come back that night, so I waited until he had a good start. Then I pulled out my saw. Before he was on the other side of the river, the hole was finished, and I was out. I knew where there was an old canoe tied up on the shore. So I took a sack of cornmeal, a side of bacon, some sugar and coffee, and headed down to the river. I filled the canoe with string, matches, a tin cup, and some blankets. Then I went back to the cabin and covered up the hole that I'd made. As part of my plan, I took Pap's shotgun from its hiding place, then went into the woods and shot a pig. I found Pap's axe and used it to smash the cabin door to bits. Next, I fetched the pig inside, cut open its throat, and let its blood make a trail wherever I dragged it. Ooh, wow. Then I pulled out some of my hair and stuck it on the axe on the cabin door. The whole thing looked like someone had hacked his way into the cabin, killed me, and dragged my body off somewhere. When it was dark, I moved the canoe down the river and waited under some willows for the moon to rise. I took a bite to eat, and by laid down in the canoe to smoke my pipe and figure out a plan. I knew the townspeople would drag the river for my body, but they would soon get tired of that. Maybe they would hunt for the robbers who broke into the cabin. But right now, I needed to find some place to hide. So I decided to head for Jackson's Island. I knew the place pretty well. When the moon rose, I pushed off in the canoe, and soon I was on my way. It didn't take long to get to the island. Once I landed and tied up my canoe, I headed for the big log at the head of the island. From there, I could see way over to town, 3 miles away. The lights were twinkling, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost see the widow Douglas inside the big house on the hill. There was a little gray in the sky now as dawn came on, so I stepped into the woods and lay down for a nap before breakfast. That's the end of chapter 3. Chapter 4, Finding Jim. The sun was so high in the sky when I woke up that I figured it was after 8 o'clock. I lay there on the grass in the cool shade, looking up at the sun through the holes in the branches. I felt rested and satisfied. A couple of squirrels sat on a limb and jabbered at me in a friendly way. I was lazy and comfortable and didn't even want to get up to cook breakfast. So I started dozing off again, when suddenly I heard a deep booming sound. It came from way up the river. I sat up and rested on my elbow, listening. Pretty soon I heard it again. I jumped up and ran down to the river. A ferry boat full of people was heading towards the island. Suddenly I knew what was happening. They were firing a canyon over the water because they believed it would make a drowned body come to the top. And they were searching for mine. I stood hidden in the bushes, watching the cannon smoke and listening to the booms. I lit a pipe and had a good long smoke while I went on watching. By and by, the boat drifted so close to the shore that I could have almost touched it. I saw most everybody on that boat. Pap, the Judge Thatcher, Joe Harper, and Tom Sawyer, and plenty more. I could hear them all talking about a murder, my murder. Suddenly the captain called out, "Look sharp now. The current sets in the closest here, and maybe he's washed ashore and got tangled amongst the brush at the water's edge." I hope so, anyway. I didn't hope so. Everybody crowded up and leaned over the rails, nearly in my face. They kept still, watching with all their might. When they didn't find anything, they gave up and headed back towards town. I knew I was all right now. Nobody else would come hunting for me. I got my traps out of the canoe and made a nice camp in the thick woods. I set up a tent out of my blankets so I'd have a place to put my things where the rain couldn't get at them. Then I caught a catfish and roasted it over a fire. When it was dark, I sat by my campfire, smoking and feeling pretty well satisfied. After a while, it got sort of lonesome, so I listened to the current swashing along and counted the stars until I fell asleep. And so it was for 3 days and nights No difference, just the same. But on the fourth day, I went exploring around the island. My island. I was the boss of it. It all belonged to me, so to say, and I wanted to know all about it. I was walking along when all of a sudden, in a clearing, I bounded right onto the ashes of a campfire. They were still warm. My heart jumped into my lungs. I never waited to look further, but uncocked my gun and went sneaking back to the camp as quiet and as fast as I could. Every now and then, I stopped for a second amongst the thick leaves and listened again. As soon as I got back to my camp, I put out the fire, hid my traps, and climbed up into a tree. I reckon I was up there for 2 to 3 hours, but I didn't see or hear a thing. Well, I couldn't stay up there forever, so at last I climbed down. But that time it was dark, and I was pretty hungry. But I didn't dare make a fire, so I went to sleep hungry. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't somehow, because I was thinking all the time. By and by, I said to myself, I can't live this way. I'm going to find out who's here on this island with me. I'll find it out or I'll bust. So I began searching all around the island. And after a while, I caught a glimpse of a fire through the trees. I went towards it, slowly and cautiously. Soon I was close enough to have a look. And there on the ground lay a man. He had a blanket over most of his body, and his head was nearly in the fire. Pretty soon he yawned and stretched. Then he threw off the blanket. It was Jim, Miss Watson's slave. At that time in Missouri, it was still legal to have slaves. And Jim and I had gotten to be friends when I'd lived at the widow's. I was sure glad to see him. Hello, Jim, I said, skipping out of the bushes. He jumped up and stared at me with a wild look. Then he dropped down on his knees and gasped, Don't hurt me, don't. I never hurt a ghost. I always like dead people. You go get back in the river where you belong. Well, it took some talking, but I finally made him understand that I wasn't dead. But I was ever so glad to see him. I wasn't lonesome now. I talked on, telling Jim everything that had happened to me. But Jim only sat there looking at me and never said a word. Finally, we went over to where the canoe was tied up, and while Jim built a fire in the grassy open places among the trees, I fetched some meal, bacon, coffee, and sugar from the boat. We cooked breakfast, and it was ready. We lolled on the grass and ate it. Jim laid into it with all of his might, for he was almost starved. Then, when he'd gotten pretty well stuffed, he relaxed and said, Listen here, Huck. I got to tell you why I'm here, but you must never tell a soul. After a while, Jim told me a story. Well, Huck, I had to run off, he said. Miss Watson, she picked on me all the time and treated me poorly, but she always said she wouldn't sell me down to New Orleans. But I noticed there was a slave trader around the place a lot, and I began to get uneasy. Well, one night I crept home late, and I heard Miss Watson tell the widow that she was going to sell me down to New Orleans for $800. It was so much money, she just couldn't resist. The widow tried to talk her out of it, but I got so scared, I never waited to hear the rest. I lit out mighty quick, I tell you. So for the past week, Jim was in hiding too. We both agreed that it was good to have company, and we set about fishing for our lunch. That's the end of chapter 4. I'll be back with chapter 5 and chapter 6, so stay tuned.